The readerly text. As we have just indicated, the readerly text is the result of so smooth a match of the reader or viewer with the classic textual model that the two are, for all intents and purposes, identical. Consequently, readerly and classic will here be used as interchangeable terms, with the understanding that it is only through the readerly approach that an individual classic text can be made fully to approximate its model. The readerly or classic text strives above all for homogeneity. It organizes its materials according to the principle of non-contradiction, stressing at all points the compatible nature of circumstances. This is not to say that the readerly text eliminates oppositions. On the contrary, it uses them as a major structuring device. Parenthetical comment, as McKee does with controlling idea and counter idea. However, it rigorously limits the number of oppositions which can come into play at any juncture and the manner in which they can be articulated. The exemplary classic text projects the same oppositions onto every level of the fiction: character, action, setting, theme, etc. Moreover, it does so in ways which admit of no interrogation or no integration, and hence no change in the existing cultural order. It shows a marked preference for paradox, most theological of oppositional tropes, and antithesis, most ideological, but it steers clear of contradiction, which would challenge the imperative of inevitability. The readerly text purports to be a transcript of a reality which pre-exists and exceeds it, and it tightly controls the play of signification by subordinating everything to this transcendental meaning. It encourages the reader or viewer to move away from its signifiers, which are understood as secondary, toward a privileged and originating signified. It is the direction of meaning which determines the two major management functions of the classic text. The author is always supposed to go from signified to signifier, from content to form, from idea to text, from passion to expression. And in contrast, the critic goes in the other direction, works back from signifiers to signified. The mastery of meaning, a veritable semiurgism, is a divine attribute. Once this meaning is defined as the discharge, the emanation, the spiritual effluvium overflowing from the signified toward the signifier, the author is a god. His place of origin is the signified. As for the critic, he is the priest whose task is to decipher the writing of the god. The readerly text thus attempts to conceal all traces of itself as a factory within which a particular social reality is produced through standard representations and dominant signifying practices. Reflexivity provides one of the most successful means of effecting this concealment. The readerly text often foregrounds its own stylistic operations as a means of deflecting attention away from the more broadly cultural pressures at work upon it. Through this strategy, the text seems to refer primarily to the reality of a private consciousness, a category which dictates the terms of its own analysis, and so escapes any probing scrutiny. Texts of this sort, which include such illustrious novels as Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire and James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, as well as a cinematic corpus within which the films of Federico Fellini centrally figure, have been dubbed self-conscious. They generally enjoy critical esteem precisely because they seem to issue from an author who conforms to the paradigm of the Cartesian subject, autonomous, self-knowing, capable of thinking worlds into existence. Reflexive texts feature the author as transcendental, signified. Another way in which many 19th and 20th century novels and short stories efface the signs of their actual production resembles the reverse shot formation within classic cinema. A voice within the fiction claims responsibility for the discourse, thus covering over the cultural enunciation. This can be done obliquely, through a third-person narrative of the sort found in many Henry James stories, such as What Maisie Knew, where events are filtered through a single and rather obtrusive point of view, through a framing technique of the kind used in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where attention is constantly drawn to the fictional process of narrating, or through a first-person narrative, continuous, as in Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, or intermittent, as in Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. Barth emphasizes that the classic text depends upon a linear reading or viewing. Any deviation from that norm threatens its existence. This is because the classic text is finally nothing more than a large-scale predication, that is, a statement which defines and situates a subject. As we noted in the preceding chapter, discourse requires readers and viewers who will identify with the subjects it projects, who will agree to be spoken through them. In other words, it requires readers and viewers who will accede to the terms of its linear unfolding. It enlists those readers and viewers by fostering in them a desire for closure and a belief in the revelatory nature of endings. Narrative represents a particularly powerful syntagmatic lure, affirming the coherence of the text and binding the reader or viewer to it in a relationship of pleasurable dependence. However, poetry also has its syntagmatic lures: rhyme, meter, structural expectations, the couplet, the refrain. What Barth writes of narrative thus holds equally true for all classic texts, except that in the case of a lyric poem, there will be a higher degree of compression. The dramatic narrative is a game with two players, the snare and the truth. At first, a tremendous indetermination rules their encounters. The wandering is wide of the mark. Gradually, however, the two networks move closer together, co-penetrate. Determination is completed, and with it the subject. The game is ended. The drama has its denouement. The subject, correctly predicated, fixed. The discourse can do nothing more than fall silent. At the moment of closure toward which every readerly experience moves, the reader or viewer enjoys an illusory sense of liberation. Illusory because through that closure his or her subjectivity has been reconfirmed. Subjectivity must be constantly reactivated in this way. Hence the readerly text is a disposable product, designed to be consumed during one encounter. More always wait on the shelf. Rereading is an operation contrary to the commercial and ideological habits of our society, which would have us throw away the story once it has been consumed, devoured, so that we can then move on to another story, buy another book, and is tolerated only in certain marginal categories of readers: children, old people, and professors. Barth's point obviously pertains less to poetry than it does to narrative forms. Poetry is itself marginal in our culture, and on those rare occasions when it is read at all, it is almost always reread or memorized. As we shall see, the writerly text engages the reader or writer or viewer in a productive rather than a consumptive capacity. It opts for heterogeneity rather than unity, and instead of the familiar, it looks for the alien and the unpredictable. Finally, far from striving for transparency, it attempts to foreground the traces of its cultural inscription.